Velkommen til en ekstra episode med Neil Woods. Denne episoden også på engelsk. Hvis du vil ha norsk oversettelse, så kan du klikke på videoen på Spotify for eksempel, eller på YouTube. Okay, welcome back. We just finished the regular episode for the podcast. And yesterday when we did the event at Litteraturhuset, you did such a great lecture covering many of the same things that we covered in the episode, the previous episode now. And a lot of people had questions for you during your lecture, and I promised that I would ask them your questions in this podcast so they could get their answers. So, yeah, we'll just get to it, I guess.
Yeah.
So the first question is about your work as, or related to your previous work as like an undercover cop. So this person is asking, now that you're in the public eye, do you get recognized by people who got arrested as a direct result of your undercover work in the past?
Well, no, I don't. Not by people who got arrested. I don't think so anyway. Maybe they wouldn't feel confident enough to come up to me. But I do get recognised. And I get recognised quite a lot, actually. So all of the stuff that I've done on social media, it was quite a surprise to me how much I'd start to get recognised. So I get recognised routinely at train stations, music festivals. So last year I did a speaking gig at a music festival called Wilderness in the UK. And on the first day, I got recognised by 12 people, 12 different people coming up to me saying, "You're Neil Woods." I'm like, yeah, I know.
Yeah.
And yeah, I get recognised by people who come up to me on the street. You know, last time I was in a pub in Bristol, the bar person, you know, recognised me. It's just like I get recognised a hell of a lot, but none of them have said that they'd been arrested as a result. But you know. But so not necessarily, but I do get recognised a great deal, and it's really, really odd, because, you know, my intent was never to have a public profile.
Yeah.
I'm generally an introvert. I don't necessarily enjoy the attention.
Yeah.
Not really. So it's a strange thing. It's a really, really strange thing. But you know, it just comes with the territory, and you've got to do it, haven't you?
Yeah. Yeah, but that's great as well. Even though like you would prefer to keep a low profile, you think it's important to like use your voice and your experiences to help get this case forward. So that's really great. Yeah.
I actually think I've got no choice.
Yeah.
To be honest, because how can I?
Like a moral duty.
Yeah, I've got a moral duty. I've got a duty, and again, I think there's a neurodiversity thing coming in here that I have to follow what I think is my duty.
Yeah.
Which was the same in policing as it is out of policing, I suppose.
Yeah. So the next question was also about undercover work. And this person was wondering, in your lecture, you were talking about how organised crime make use of their knowledge of undercover police work existing, for instance, informants, and they might inform on someone or a rival gang, for instance, to take them down and then use that opportunity to capture the market, for instance, right? So this person was asking, are there other reasons why they would want to tell on an opponent? Could it, for instance, be not only that they wanted their market share, but that they wanted to introduce like a new drug, and maybe that drug was like more addictive, or it was more profitable, or to create like a monopoly?
Yeah, I mean, organised crime do use the police informant system, and there is a lack of honesty within policing as to the extent of that and the extent of how they recognise that. So the police informant system is absolutely huge, because anybody who comes into the police, even for possession or any drug arrest, they are likely the police will ask them, you know, do you want to tell us any information? And sometimes there will be some real pressure to do so, especially if you're looking at a large prison sentence. The temptation of reducing that prison sentence by 40% is an extraordinary pressure extraordinary. But what organised crime are very good at is planting informants into the hands of police. Now, informants are not just giving information to reduce their sentence. They will sometimes get paid. Now, I once did a radio debate on a BBC radio station because there had been this news report about the amount of money that were being paid to informants. And so there was a public debate about it. And I debated this police officer who was an informant handler. And in this debate, he actually admitted that he had paid one informant £14,000. £14,000 for one job. And he justified this because it was for a cannabis grow, a cannabis factory, which was valued at £250,000. So this, I mean, I've got great knowledge of the informant system, but this blew my mind completely, that they valued this piece of the market at £250,000. And so therefore they decided that the value of that information was worth £14,000. So I'm thinking, but hang on, no one's gone without their cannabis today. That's you might have valued that at £250,000, but the size of the market stayed the same. So I think you're warping your own mathematics a little bit. But then I had to say to him, okay, so you've paid out this rather lucky chap who's found this information for you. Who did he work for? And this cop said, well, what do you mean, who did he work for? Well, it's really handy if you can get rid of a rival's grow. It means you're more likely to be able to sell yours quickly, right? That's the way it works, right? You know, you understand the drug market. You're a drugs market expert. He's going, no, but. He had no idea who that person worked for. He was just an informant who came to them with police and negotiated a price. You try to tell me it's not likely he works for a rival organised crime group? So, I mean, I'm just telling you that story because it highlights the farce of the entire informant system, that the police are mistakenly confident in how they're in control of that system. And over 95% of police informants are for the drug market.
It's quite nasty, like who you're going to trust with that information when it goes both ways like that. Both of them are like using it quite efficiently.
Exactly.
I assume, yeah.
Now, if you consider that every person who provides information to the police puts themselves at risk of retribution, except the person who's working for another organised crime group, they're not so much at risk, are they? So it just adds another lens to that. Now, the part of the question where would it be to introduce some new drug? No, I don't think so, because the market is the market. The demand is the demand, and the supply meets the demand. You know, this sort of idea that organised crime are corrupting our society by looking for new drugs to corrupt it with, that's a prohibitionist view. That's a sort of prohibitionist lens of it. Now, yeah, okay, you know, you do get new drugs coming into the market, but it's normally that's a response to policing. So the biggest example of that is the heroin market getting synthetic opioids, because that's a way of adapting to the pressures of policing, because a nitazene is potentially 100 times stronger per weight, which means it's easier to smuggle. So organised crime aren't bringing nitazenes into the market because they're more addictive. That's the prohibitionist stance. They're bringing into the market to make it more efficient in response to policing.
Yeah. I think also to like add some to that response. Like people have their like people who use drugs, they have some preferences for what drug that they want to use.
Yeah.
And if that drug, for some reason, the access to that one is for some reason like shifted, sometimes they might get like another substance instead, but some of that time, sometimes they don't even know that it isn't the same drug. For instance, with MDMA, we had a lot of deaths a few years back with young people here in Norway. They thought they were buying MDMA, but it was PMMA or something instead.
Yeah.
So that's also like a danger with
exactly.
policing.
Yeah. And that's just the prohibition problem, right?
Yeah.
It's a lack of regulation.
Okay, so we got quite a few questions related to corruption as well. And the first one is, so we've seen in the last year or two that Norway seems to become like a transition country or a transit country for cocaine. So we've seen suddenly these like huge seizures of containers of cocaine, which we never saw before. But in general, it's thought that it isn't going to the Norwegian market because the cocaine consumption rates just aren't high enough. We're not enough people to use so much cocaine. It's coming in here. But the question is whether you think we have corrupted like mayors or police officers or other officials here in Norway, considering we are getting these containers as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is always a really uncomfortable question to answer because the vast majority of people, your border guards, your police officers, they're going to be good people and they're doing a good job, honestly, and they're not corrupted. You have to say that. But also, yes, there will be corrupt assets. Absolutely, there are corrupt assets everywhere. And I had a disagreement with a Norwegian cop a few years ago. I think it was 2017, and he said, I was trying to talk about the prevalence of corruption, how we can't combat it with prohibition. We just can't. And he said, yes, but we're not as corrupt here as you are in the UK. And that's how dismissive he was. He had that really sense of superiority.
Yeah, the Norwegian police is just like more moral or better educated.
He was looking down on us Brits as being just corrupt. You're corrupt, we're not. And then, of course, 6 months later, you had that head of the drug squad in Oslo arrested. So
yeah, Erik Jensen. Yeah.
Yeah. So I sort of had the last laugh in terms of that conversation, but that's the point. One example, one person being caught is never going to be just the only one, right? It's never. And we know that from the way corruption works internationally. So the answer is yes, absolutely there is. But as to the extent of the corruption, well, I very, very much doubt that the corruption here is anywhere near as widespread as it is in Guinea, for example. But what I would say, and this is an important note of warning, that corruption worldwide is only going in one direction for as long as we have prohibition. That's important to bear in mind.
To add to the question, do you think why do you think corruption levels might be lower in Norway than some of these other countries?
It's further along the supply route.
Yeah.
You've got the focal point where wealth makes a difference. Poorer countries, it's easier to corrupt because the value of the money is higher per dollar. Yeah. But it's at the focal point. It's the beginning point, the important point at the beginning of the supply route. So as the supply routes go out, the corruption to a certain extent becomes diluted. It's not the end. Obviously, there is the beginning of Norway being used as a transit country, which means it's not the end of the supply chain. It's not the end of the supply route,
and that could bring about more.
That could bring about more corruption because if you're talking wholesale figures, you're talking wholesale wealth. If you're talking a wholesale batch, you're talking more money that's needed to corrupt, to ease the flow of that through your ports or wherever it goes. So yeah, it is a sign that you will have more investment in corruption than you did before.
So we had a person asking the following: speaking of corruption and the rise of far-right policies, would it be a strategic investment for criminal organized groups in the drug market to fund right-wing parties and politicians? And do you think that's happening right now?
God, that's a really good question, isn't it? So do you think there's going to be people watching this who didn't there's going to be people watching this who didn't hear the lecture.
Yeah,
isn't there?
probably.
So,
yeah.
And we didn't cover this in the podcast, so I need to set the scene with this one. So the point I made, that this is a question in response to, is that aside from all of the other problems with corruption and the destabilisation of society that brings, there is also the fact that where police increase their activity in the drug market and they ramp up the arrests and seizures, that kind of thing, as I explained in the podcast, that leads to an increase in violence, and this disruption in the market also leads to violence, where there's constant jostling for position in the market in response to the activities of police. Now, one of the best examples of this in the world, and there are many examples, but one of the best in the world is actually here in Norway with Norway's neighbour. And the reason it's one of the best examples in the world is because you have this comparative situation where in 2017, I think I'm right, Norway decided to step at least a little bit away from prohibition. And the aggression in the policing of the drug markets was reduced.
That was at least like when we started having the conversations that led us to almost decriminalization. And now, as of this year, down criminalization. Do you say that? Like a less criminal.
Yeah, less criminalization.
Yeah.
And one of the focal points for that shift in policy was not criminalizing people who had a problematic relationship with drugs, right? And that's important because they consume a large amount of the market value. So it is an important step. And it's important because you can see on a graph, and I've seen a graph, in terms of the violence within the drug market from that point in time, where Norway, which used to be in complete step with Sweden, went in a different direction. And what that's meant is you can see the increase in violence in Sweden, where they've gone the opposite way. They've had more laws, they've had more criminalisation. So they've increased it. So there's been a real divide between the two countries. And you can see that Norway's had less violence, Sweden's had a dramatic uptick. Dramatic. To the point that they've got something, I think it's 138 explosions last year. Improvised explosive devices, grenades, automatic weapons. It's open warfare. Now, one of the reasons it's important to highlight Sweden is because I talk about this internationally. Although I've mentioned this comparison all over the world. And it's important because you've got that evidence, but also because Sweden's only 10 million people and they've got all this extraordinary violence, which is, you compare it with other European countries, it's really extreme. It's really, really extreme. But what it's done is it's increased the fear of crime. And where you increase the fear of crime, that plays into the rhetoric of right-wing politics. And this has happened in Sweden, they've blamed immigration. They said all this is violence because of immigrants. Immigrants didn't cause prohibition, and all of this violence is in the drug market. So it's a lie from the far right. It is a lie. It's not immigrants causing this. It's drug prohibition. And it's not just drug prohibition, it's the aggressive policing of drug prohibition, which they've got in Sweden. But to bring it to the question, is it in the interests of drugs organised crime to fund the politically right which exploit that situation? And that's not a question I've considered. But in response to that, I would say that it suits organised crime to have that rhetoric because it distracts from what they're doing. It maintains the chaos, which suits them. It does suit them. So my answer is yes. I think it is feasible. I don't know how feasible, but it is feasible that there could be financial backing for that kind of political rhetoric. Yes.
Yeah, so it is weird in a way to wrap your head around how it would actually benefit organized crime to have like more intense policing. It just seems like completely, it seems like the best scenario for them would just be to be like left alone and just do their own thing and police wouldn't care. That seems like they would earn more money, but like you're actually saying that it's better for them to be
Yeah, because
have the police
the
going
people
after
fighting
them?
and bombing each other and shooting each other are not the people making the money from it. That's the people above. And remember that the market never shrinks from any police activity. It never shrinks. So the value in that market stays the same. It stays the same. So the people who are making the real money, who are a step away from the firefights on the streets, they're making more money. And the police their police resources are completely swamped by the chaos in the streets. It suits them. It suits them. And there are other reasons why it suits them. Because you find in a traumatized society, people use more drugs more problematically. And we know this is true. There is evidence to back that up.
Yeah. Yeah. Moving along, we have a second question that is quite similar, but it's asking about, so we were talking about also in the podcast how legalizing and regulating cocaine would be absolutely catastrophic for these organized crime groups because it's their investment bank for all the other crime that they're also doing. So this person is wondering, do you think that these illegal groups use their money, resources, or other means to influence politics in European countries or elsewhere in order to avoid steps towards regulations of the illegal market?
I think if this political situation happened where there was a real chance of regulating the cocaine market and those organised criminals believed they were going to lose their market, then they would suddenly be investing huge amounts of money into the political opposition to prevent that from happening. I'm sure of that. However, at the moment, organised crime don't need to.
Yeah.
Because by accident or design or whatever, they already have plenty of allies keeping their business in place for them. They already have prohibitionist and moralising politicians who are arguing from their own points of view to maintain the status quo. So organised crime are sitting pretty. They don't have to invest anything in politics at the moment because politics is doing their job for them. For now.
Moving to the Amazon and then more about different solutions. There is a question about pollution related to cocaine production. So the question is the pollution that happens when they're producing the cocaine powder, is that happening to reduce production costs, or is it to evade control? And how do the pollution levels from legal cocaine compare to the pollution levels? And this is, of course, just go ahead and we'll...
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and it's a really important question as well because, there is huge amounts of pollution. I mean, it's not the most significant ecological impact of the cocaine market, but some of the pollution is significant because one of the refining chemicals that they use to turn the cocaine paste into cocaine hydrochloride is actually gasoline. It's one of the production petrol. So there are some really toxic chemicals which are dumped in the rainforest. But of course, every time you seize a plantation or production facility that moves somewhere else, it means someone else is contaminated as well. So the policing of it spreads it. But the question is really good because it's the comparison between what could a regulated market and an unregulated market and a regulated market. And it's a simple answer. There is no contamination issue with a regulated cocaine production. There's none. Doesn't need to be any pollution.
Yeah, there doesn't need to be. I think that one is like a very
good
thing to say because when you regulate something, you have the power to design everything about it.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. You can mandate what is required in the production of cocaine to ensure by legal regulation that there is no contamination to the environment. You can do that because it's not that complicated a chemical process to extract and develop cocaine into hydrochloride or base. It's not that complicated. And we have much more toxic chemical industries where the waste products from those chemical industries are successfully managed with no damage to the environment. This is entirely a regulatory issue.
Yeah, and that's important because we have good regulations and bad regulations of many different products that can cause harm.
Yeah.
And it is the option if you were to talk about like a legal cocaine market to put in place and to embed all of those things, but also embed not only environmental considerations but also social justice elements.
Exactly that. Yes. And it's important that when we do design cocaine regulation, when it does happen, because it'll have to happen eventually. It'll be the 11th hour, but eventually this has to happen. We just need to try and make it happen sooner. It will come eventually. But when we do, it needs to be designed by those people most affected by the catastrophe of the current policy, and indigenous people to whose lives this really affects the most.
So there's a person asking, so they're stating that decriminalisation is helpful to reduce damage to people who are using drugs.
Yes.
Do you think it has any impact on drug cartels? Or is it only regulation that's going to do anything at all about this issue?
So obviously, you can have the biggest impact with regulation because you're talking about taking the whole market away from organised crime. However, decriminalisation actually does have an impact on the market. It does. And the reason is that if you decriminalise possession, that means that people are able to seek help because they're not stigmatised and criminalised. And if you can seek help if you have an addiction, you can reduce your consumption. And reducing consumption affects the market. And that can be dramatic, actually, because the most for heroin, and to a certain extent cocaine, there's evidence for this as well, that the most problematic 10% of consumers consume 50% of the market value of the drug. So if you are able to take care of people who are using the drug problematically, and in a decriminalised regime, you can more successfully look after people, then you can dramatically reduce the size of the consumption within that market, which can dramatically impact on the financial clout of organised crime because you're reducing their customer base.
Yeah, and I know, so the case of Portugal has been under some quite hard weather. I don't know if you've heard this, as well, yeah. So it used to be this perfect example of how decriminalization was really good, and now a lot of people criticize it and they say, oh, it's not going so well anyways, and it doesn't really help. And even though like people from representatives from Portugal, they're saying that, okay, it's not having the same impact maybe as before, but that's not because anything was wrong with the policy. It's because now we lack the funding to do the healthcare. That was really important in the beginning.
Yeah.
But not to get like too into the weeds with that, I think with decriminalization, even like if you took away the stigma, people could seek help.
Yeah.
But there's still, I know in Norway at least, there's like a significant lack of funding for good healthcare for those people. And we also know that like drug rehabilitation, we don't know too much about like what works or not. So I'm not sure if, like, it would be great if we could really give the help to that 10% that consume the 50% of the market value, and in that way make the impact. But I'm also, we have a lot of work to do when it comes to like successful rehabilitation. But of course, decriminalization is like such an important step for those people, even. And maybe even more so than when they already have like a very significant problem, being able to go to a doctor in the early phases when you're understanding that something is maybe not going in the right direction is probably like easier than helping out with the people who've been stuck in that situation for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I agree. And you know, the decriminalization is more successful the more investment you have in a health response. And I think it's important also to note that something just around the corner that's going to have a massive impact on that is psychedelic therapy. Because psychedelic therapy is particularly applicable to people who are self-medicating for trauma. And most people who have a problematic relationship with drugs are self-medicating for trauma, and the most problematic users are self-medicating for childhood trauma. So psychedelics are going to be the whole answer to that, I think, or at least a very, very significant part of that. But also, you can factor into a decriminalisation policy a safe supply within a medical model. You can supply, you should be able to supply medical grade cocaine to look after somebody who has a problem with cocaine, because at least if you're supplying a safe medical supply to that person, they are no longer being exploited by organised crime.
Yes.
They're no longer being exploited as a sex worker. They're no longer being exploited to commit other crimes, which has a knock-on beneficial effect to the rest of your society anyway. So we shouldn't be looking at decriminalisation as an island, as a singular policy that can only be considered with walls around it. We need to be thinking about it as a philosophy of what is a pragmatic thing we can do for this person. What can we do for these people?
Yeah.
And part of that is safe supply. And of course, if you can have a safe supply for cocaine and heroin, you are pulling the rug from under organised crime. You are snatching money out of their pockets. You are crippling their ability to invest in other criminality. You're crippling their ability to corrupt the system.
Yeah. Maybe our organizations, of course, think that decriminalization is very important, and we're working very hard in order to achieve those changes. At the same time, though, I was thinking about what you just said about this group of users who are problematic users. And there are things with substitution treatment, for instance, that could be done, or safe supply. And that could also happen even if decriminalization wasn't passed. Because right now we have trials at the hospitals, 2 hospitals, I think, in Norway, where heroin users get heroin at the hospital daily, so they don't have to go to the illicit market. So maybe that is even more pragmatic, easier way of taking them out of the illicit drug economy than going for just rehabilitation. Of course, they should be offered both things. They shouldn't just have to, now you're addicted, you have to do government cocaine the rest of your life. They should also, of course, be offered ways to reduce the use. And I think that's also part of what they're doing at the hospital with heroin. But yeah, I think we might not even have to wait for decriminalization in order to work on these things.
Yeah, exactly. And to be clear, it is my belief that the single most beneficial thing you can do within all of the drug policy options is to be able to supply a safe supply of heroin to people who use heroin problematically. So I'm very pleased that is going on at hospitals in Norway, and I would imagine that that's been based on the Swiss model because of the extraordinary successes that they've had in Switzerland. But the killer for me as a drug policy activist is that the Swiss used British evidence for that at a point when Britain went in the wrong direction. But Switzerland dramatically reduced their crime as a result of that. They don't have a heroin problem anymore because they had that policy, and they've had it since 1994, because as a result of it, the market shrunk so much.
Yeah,
it's extraordinarily beneficial. The evidence is really powerful. But my warning is that you should not be too conservative and too restrictive with that in Norway. And you should also bear this in mind, that this idea that you can only go on to heroin-assisted treatment once you've failed other treatments. Well, methadone and buprenorphine, the substitute therapies, they medicate withdrawal. But heroin medicates trauma. And that's the difference. That's why you shouldn't have to fail 2 forms of treatment first. You should be looked at as a person, and heroin should be an option for the drug worker and prescribing doctor to give to that person if they think it's appropriate as a first line response. Because consider a young woman is a first presentation for heroin addiction to a treatment doctor, and for 3 months she's been sexually exploited. She's doing sex work and she's been sexually exploited by some very brutal gangsters. Now, if you give her heroin straight away, you're rescuing her from that situation. If you force her to fail methadone and buprenorphine first, she's had another year of trauma. We need to be looking at what's happening, and we need to treating people as an individual and completely remove all of the moral judgment, all of it. And you're right, you don't even need to have decriminalisation. You can do that. You could do that policy overnight if the will was there.
Yeah. Yeah. So when talking about like the different solutions, you've been using the term regulation of cocaine a lot. And then there's a person asking, what does that really mean? Does it mean that we have to legalise cocaine?
Well, it does. I mean, to me, I want to push the Overton window and keep it open. Really, we the only answer for this intersection between drug policy and especially cocaine policy in the climate is that we need to take legal control of the whole market, which means governments in control, not gangsters. That's the phrase, governments, not gangsters. Now, what that means for cocaine regulation is that, well, we'd need to look at it very carefully. How are we going to regulate this and get the best experts to do so? Ideally, I see the same future as what Transform Drug Policy Foundation does. They publish brilliant publications on this, Blueprint, how to regulate stimulants. And really, you look at this in different tiers. So the first tier would be a Coca drink, a Coca tonic. And interestingly, in alcohol prohibition in the 1920s, or just before alcohol prohibition, actually, the Temperance Society of America were recommending that people use cocaine drinks, cocaine tonics, as a safer alternative to alcohol. And, the fascinating thing is, actually, it is safer than alcohol. It is. The science says so.
But not by so very much, though. It's like slightly safer, but not so much safer.
Well, I mean, it depends. If you look at the comparative harms index that Professor David Nutt did, there's quite a big difference between alcohol and cocaine, particularly in the societal harms section.
It is true. It is true. Any listener should check out his study and look at the scale that he made with different drugs, and he ranked them in terms of both harm to the individual and harm to society. And alcohol is by far the worst drug, and then it is followed by. Is it methamphetamine or something? I'm not quite sure which order it is.
Alcohol, heroin, crack cocaine, methamphetamine.
Okay, right. So you can see, but even though they're, I guess what you're saying, that even though they're all ranked that these are the most harmful drugs of the ones that he investigated and the most commonly consumed, because there are like really weird, strange ones that would probably be more harmful than the ones he looked at. Yeah. So even though they're like in the top 5, alcohol is still like so much worse, especially on a societal scale. That's what you're. Yeah.
So, but the thing is about once you're regulating a drug, if you look at alcohol, and alcohol's a really good example, is that there is evidence that where a milder form of a drug is available, people prefer the milder drug. So more people drink beer than drink whiskey, right? It's the same for most drugs. So if you can regulate and provide the mildest form of a drug, you will be capturing a large proportion of that market who will shift quite happily and even enthusiastically to something which is a milder form of the drug. So your cocaine tonic drink, which is a mild form of coca. You can have, even below that, you could have coca leaf products, which are really mild because they're not even refined. So you've got coca at the bottom, which probably doesn't need any regulation because it's like, it's just like a cup of tea. You can have those products. You can have the slightly more, maybe stronger cocaine tonic type drinks. And then you get into the parts where the stronger stuff, like the cocaine hydrochloride. And you'd have to work out exactly how you measure those doses, how those doses are sold and packaged. And according to Transform's work and documents, authored mostly by the brilliant Steve Rolls, who I think you've also had.
Yeah, he was my previous guest.
Yeah. So Steve is brilliant, and he articulates this far better than I do. But just to reinforce points that I'm sure he's made, is that then you have a licensed pharmacy where you know that someone is the correct age to buy the drug, and you can have a limited amount to sell in one go. And once you get that regulated market for the stronger forms of cocaine, you will have a reduction in underage consumption, because drug dealers in prohibition don't ask for ID. You will reduce underage consumption. You will. We know that as for what's happened in cannabis markets. But also, you will have less problematic consumption because regulation does that. You will have less adulteration and less risks within the product. And then for the more stronger forms and the people who have developed an addiction problem with crack cocaine, then you have a medicalised model to look after those people, much along the same lines as we've been discussing heroin-assisted treatment. You have cocaine medicalised. And so you have different tiers of the types of regulation, and that's what it needs to look like. No one is ever going to claim that regulatory system is going to be a perfect, harm-free situation. But legal regulation is the least worst option, because drugs are hard to manage, but they're not going away.
Yeah. We have another question. It's like just in the same pattern that we were talking about right now. So this person is stating that they find the question about cannabis regulation easy, and that we should just do. It's like
I agree.
Outright of course the best solution. But with cocaine, they have doubts. And they're really struggling with concluding that what should be done about the drug. They're stating that the economic arguments that you've been presenting and for the climate, they're very compelling. It makes a lot of sense. But that the health and addiction profile of cocaine really speaks against legalization. So you touched a little bit on it, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about like this balancing of public health with saving the rainforest or ending corruption.
Well, the thing is about that question is that it assumes that the current policy has any impact on health. It doesn't. The cocaine market is massive and growing, and there's nothing we can do about it. There is policing doesn't have any impact. Our current policy has no impact. People are using cocaine when they want to anyway, and it's increasing because demand is increasing. It's going to broader parts of society. So we have a choice. People using it with prohibition or people using it under control. Those are the choices. So that sort of supersedes any concern, really. We just have no choice. You cannot reduce drug consumption with prohibition. You can't. And the evidence backs that up. To any police leader or any moralising politician, give me the evidence that that policing activity has had any impact in reducing the size of the market at all. There is no evidence to support that view. Because the cocaine market is accelerating, meeting the demand which is there, that policy has no impact over. It now would be a good time to get control of the market to slow down that acceleration. Because we cannot slow down that acceleration under prohibition, because we're not controlling it. Criminals are controlling it. Criminals are deciding to increase production. Now, you're aware of the OPEC, the people who control the oil prices. They get together to decide how many barrels are being produced. And oil prices go up and down because OPEC have got together and decided that. And the impact on the world economy is extraordinary. If they decide to reduce the production of oil by half, inflation goes through the roof. The whole world suffers. This is the situation we have with cocaine. People are getting together and deciding to increase production. Production supplies up 35% in a 12-month period. This is criminals deciding to be in control of our public health. We need governments to be in control of those mechanisms, to be in charge of our public health, to protect our children who can get access to the supply. We shouldn't be allowing a situation where criminals are allowed to sell to our children. We need to take control. So the question, it was a good question because it highlights the issue, but the question is based on an assumption that our current policy is having any impact, and it's not.
It is, but let me add to this question and try to like play devil's advocate, I guess, a little bit. So, I think that if cannabis is regulated and sold legally to adult users here in Norway, as we saw in Canada, the consumption rate was increasing a little bit, especially during when they were actually doing the regulating. When the regulation first happened, you saw an increase.
Yeah.
And I think still now you can see that the reported use among people aged like 50 to 60 is higher than it was before before regulation. And to me, that is not something to worry about. We should worry about like the young kids whose brain is still developing, and it's also, no matter what, better that they get access to like safe cannabis than like whatever is provided on the illicit markets. Also, we know that cannabis is a lot less harmful than alcohol. So we have had health officials saying that if cannabis consumption rates increased a little bit and that at the same time meant that alcohol decreased a little bit, then that would be so helpful for public health. But when it comes to cocaine, let's say that some more people tried it if it became like accessible in some sort of store, for instance, and the addiction profile is higher. It's similar to that of alcohol. Are we sure that not more people would get addicted? Or
we can't be sure. No, because up to 10%, around 10% of people who use cocaine can develop a problem with that drug. Means there's also 90% that doesn't. Now, we can't be sure. However, we can be sure of the trajectory at the moment in terms of the accelerating demand and the accelerating consumption. So we do know that in the current situation, the amount of people using cocaine is increasing. You're right that we can't be sure that trajectory wouldn't increase after regulation. But even if the trajectory stayed the same and the increased consumption was carried on just like in an unregulated market, it's still taking money away from organised crime. So you've got to look at each facet of this and where your victories are, what you want to achieve. The added advantage of having a regulated market is that you can be honest in terms of your public health advice, your dosage advice, your in what size dosage it's supplied, for example. You're not necessarily going to get people starting off doing a 50 milligram line because that's what their mate said they do. These kind of public health concerns, a lot of the public health risk come from the fact that it's unregulated and you can't give honest, clear, evidence-led advice for something that's an unregulated product because they're not allowed to use it. So you can't give them honest advice. And obviously this is a conundrum that for safer drug policies that we try and give the best harm reduction advice. So no, we can't be sure. But bear in mind, in Canada, consumption went up a bit of cannabis, but it's now down to just below pre-regulation levels, to 2014 levels. So it's come down. The biggest difference is that child consumption has gone down. And I think it has to be the number one priority is protecting young people. It has to be, because they are the most vulnerable to problems. But also there's an additional factor in that we have to push aside our misunderstandings about addiction, because addiction isn't really what political institutions think it is. They think it's a chemical hook that anyone can suffer from. It's not. People who are self-medicating are generally self-medicating for trauma, for mental health problems. And so addiction to something like cocaine or heroin is a symptom of a problem in society. And we also need to be dealing with those issues. We can also actually study what happens and adapt to it with a regulatory framework or investment in health-based responses once we have a situation where we have legal control of something. You cannot do that with an unregulated market. All of the machinations of state, all of the aspects of the government can legitimately adapt to a problem where you have regulatory control, because you can change regulations. You can shift things. You can change things by price, purity, dosage side. You can use what you're learning as you're learning from your regulated market, how best to deal with the problems that are in front of you. At the moment, prohibition is dismissing the problems and leaving it to criminals. And criminals don't care about your health or your mental health.
Well said. Why should they? They have no relation to you. They don't have any responsibility.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a good point, because this is difficult, but we have to take the responsibility. And just because something's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't try and achieve it.
Okay, so the next question is someone who is a bit frustrated, it seems like, with the political climate, and they're asking, why are some politicians so seemingly resistant to facts? For example, we know that 70 years of war on drugs have not reduced the supply of drugs, and even large drug busts do not lead to reductions in supply or increases in price. So, like, why do they just not listen?
It's quite complicated, this. There's no one answer to this, but I think one of my favourite ways of explaining this is that there's a sort of there's an unholy trinity of a feedback loop. So you've got the way that drugs are reported in the media and by journalists, which is fed by how politicians talk about it and how police talk about it. The police are not honest about the impact of drug seizures and arrests. They're not being honest with the public that this has no impact. The reason for that is because, do you call it a Home Office here?
If you call it...
Do you call it the Home Office Minister? What's your minister responsible for policing and crime?
Like Department of Justice. We don't use the same term.
All right, so the Department of Justice, so whatever it is.
Or Justice Minister or something, yeah.
Their main instruction to police leaders, the police chief of police, is to maintain public confidence. So we have this peculiar conundrum with drug policy. The police have a duty, they feel, to inform the public that they are doing what the public has tasked them to do. With drug policy, that means seizing drugs and arresting people. With it, if it was arresting a serial rapist, it would be arresting a serial rapist. They've got to tell the public that they've successfully done what they've been tasked to do. But the difference with drugs is the seizures isn't evidence of success because the market hasn't reduced in size. But the police are not being honest about that. This misleads the public. Now, politicians, we slag them off routinely for not being honest and not standing up for what's right. But the public, the politicians are only a reflection of the public. They're a reflection of the voting public. And politicians say what they believe the public believe. And so you have this feedback loop of the police misinformation amplified by journalists, amplified by the way drugs are portrayed in the media, in drama. All of these things feeds into this misunderstanding about drugs, both the risks of drugs and the benefit of the current policy. So the short answer is really that the general public don't know. They don't understand, which means the politicians respond to what they believe the public understand. So any one of these people can be brave and break that cycle. Occasionally you get a politician who will speak out and tell the truth, but they can be quite isolated. They can be brave, but it doesn't always have an impact. Sometimes it does. There are notable politicians who have had an impact within drug policy to a limited degree. What we need is police leaders, to be honest. What we need...
But do you think that the politicians, do you think that they know that it isn't working? Or do you think they're also like drawn into this entire bad feedback loop that you were talking about, and they also are under the misgivings that it is working?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most politicians, they don't understand it adequately. And the thing is about politicians is, and I'm a great admirer of politicians, because I'm just a single issue activist. The idea that I would have to be public and know a little bit about everything, it's like a nightmare, isn't it? It's awful. I would hate to be a proper politician. And I admire them for being able to do that. But it means that they have opinions on things that they don't fully understand, but they think they do. And drug policy is the great misunderstanding of our age, really. And it's a great tragedy that's being played out, that the evidence is the opposite of what is being said publicly. But of course, there are other reasons as well, because politicians find drug policy to be very convenient to attack the opposition. You know, your party's soft on drugs. And that creates a fear response in the public, which becomes a useful piece of political rhetoric. So some politicians very cynically use drug policy to appear tough on crime, as they put it, to attack the opposition, which is why I try and encourage political allies who are more progressive thinking to realise, actually, that if you're advocating for the regulation of drugs, you're being the politician who's the most tough on crime, because the evidence supports the fact that your policy would reduce crime more than the opposition. So, you know, we need to be arguing on the terms of the standard rhetoric about the crime rhetoric, etc. But it is all of those things. But, you know, we can break out of that cycle. We can by seeing ourselves as a growing movement, because we are a growing movement, by seeing ourselves as a movement which is merging with the other movements that we need to, the environmental sector, the human rights people, you know, movements are coming together. You know, Amnesty International taking a position on drug policy was very significant, really significant, because it means that those people campaigning for human rights across the board are now also campaigning in drug policy terms. They're campaigning for legal regulation. So our movement is growing, and we can take hope from that, but we just need to keep looking for those opportunities to break that cycle, to have influence over with journalists, with news editors, with politicians. You know, take the time to sit down with your politician and be patient with them. There was one additional thought, though, one additional factor with that, and that is that, and this is a question for anyone out there in the movement, that even where we win people over, and we have an audience and we win that audience over, and they think, okay, you've convinced me that drug policy is a mess, we need to decriminalise and start moving towards a regulated market. Okay, you've convinced me. But then election day comes, and they write, and if a politician is going to come on their doorstep and ask for their vote, ask them to write down their top 10 lists of things that they care about, their top 10 will not include drug policy. And that's a saliency issue. So the challenge for our movement is not just to convince people, it's to also put it at the top of their list.
Yeah.
So that's a challenge for our movement. And one of the ways that we do that is to make it clear the impact on climate policy.
Yeah, because I think for a lot of people, when I talk to them, for instance, out and about on different universities, for instance, they can tell me, okay, even if like some, like you were talking with people who agree, but let's say people who disagree also, they're like, okay, but people who care about drug policy, that's only because they want to use drugs themselves. Or the more common version, oh, well, I don't use drugs, so like it doesn't matter to me.
Yeah.
Or I don't have any in my family who do. And I think that's like such a misunderstanding, because they think that they're not affected by the prohibitionist regime, but they are. Like just like we talked about, with everyone is affected by the lack of effective climate action.
Yeah.
The earth might become a completely different place. We might be faced with a lot more climate catastrophes.
Yeah.
That's going to impact them. And also crime in their neighborhoods, corruption, dismantling of democracies all across the world. So it's about trying to make it relevant.
Authoritarian regimes start.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
All of that, yeah. But that's a challenge for our movement, and we need to be considering that saliency all of the time, and that's why we need to bring in all of our allies, our comrades from human rights, from the climate organisations. Yeah. But the hopeful thing is that the movement is growing. We are engaging with those. The event that you arranged last night, brilliantly arranged, you got Greenpeace on the same stage. This is a hopeful sign, and I think anyone watching this can afford to be hopeful. But also, please, do what you can. Get involved.
Yeah. So I think right when I disturbed you a little bit because you were about to say something which you talked about also in the lecture yesterday. So you were saying that the police, they know, like, okay, we're talking about the politicians. They might not know that this is not working, but you were saying that the police, they do know. At least the people higher up. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that? Because I don't think we covered it in the podcast, even though we did it in the lecture.
Yeah, so police leaders know the extent of corruption. Not the troops don't. The police leaders know. They do. But even the troops doing the work, if you were to ask any cop, do you think we can win the war on drugs? If you find a police officer who says, yes, we can win it, then I'll point you to a liar. Because there isn't a cop who believes that. So they are misinforming the public if they're giving the impression that we can win this. Cops, that doesn't mean cops universally think we should stop fighting the war on drugs. So they think, well, we've been tasked with this, we just got to keep trying. We've got to keep trying. We've got to keep trying. But they're not honest with the public as to the impact. And what journalists don't ask, what news editors are failing to instruct their interviewers to ask is, has this reduced crime? Has this restricted anyone's access to drugs? And the answer to those questions is absolutely no, it hasn't. And the police can never produce any evidence to contradict that because there isn't any evidence. Policing the drug markets is completely ineffective and only plays into the hands of organised crime. Now, if we could somehow create a set of rules where police have to be honest and evidence what they say to the public, this could rapidly change public opinion. Because imagine the police leader, instead of standing there triumphantly in front of the cameras, pointing to this hay bale-sized block of cocaine, saying, look, what a great job we've done. This has made the streets safer. This has prevented people killing themselves by taking too many drugs. This is the kind of things cops say. Imagine if they were no longer allowed to say that, no longer allowed to say anything they couldn't back up with evidence to the public, as a rule. It's not an unreasonable rule in a democracy, I would suggest. They'd have to say something like, yeah, we've seized this big block of cocaine. It's almost 100% pure, which is actually an indication of the stability of the market and the surplus of supply, which is probably, therefore, an indication that we've had no impact at all on the market. We don't believe anyone will have gone without their drug of choice as a result of this seizure, and we actually think that the supply that we've removed from the market has been already replaced. Now, that would be honest.
That would be honest, yeah.
But we could demand that.
Yeah.
We could. In a democracy, we can demand that kind of accountability. We could have rules for that. And that is something we should campaign for, because it's not unreasonable. It's not unreasonable. What politician is going to say, no, I demand that we give our police the right to lie?
Yeah, but like at the same time though, like I feel like we almost had that in Norway. Not exactly, but we've had some politicians who are like, because you've been following a little bit with the issues with the police officers in Norway making an organization, and then
I followed it a lot.
Yes, yeah. So we're talking about the NNPF scandal, and after all of this, we've had but also with the police using investigation tactics that they weren't allowed to use to prove possession.
Yeah.
and we've had people demand that, okay, you need to give people like an apology at least. You have to apologize to everyone who have been where police used force that they weren't allowed to use. And I can't remember like exactly what context this was, but we had some politicians who were like, no, we need to trust the police. The police it's too important. We need to have trust in them. And that was like the entire statement. It's like, yeah, not that trust should come from them acting the way that they should be acting to gain our trust. We should just have trust in the police. It's weird.
You can't afford to surrender that kind of state control of what is and what isn't allowed. You just can't do that. But of course, that's a common thing from politicians. It's also a way of a politician trying to win over the public, because the public think, I want to trust my police, and this police officer, and this politician's saying that we should. Oh, that's such a balm to me. That's made me feel better, and that's the political game. But so next year, I'm going to be doing a lot of work on this. Sort of demand of the police telling the truth. So I'm doing some work with some people going to be doing some vox pops, some social media, and it's going to be something that I'm going to work on for the Law Enforcement and Public Health Conference, which is next year. It's an international conference, but next year it's in Leeds at the beginning of September. So it's something I'm going to be working on through the year. But I just ask you all, please think about how we might achieve this. What does this look like in terms of a demand from civil society, and what structures could it take? What I'm working on is a document which I'm hopefully going to workshop at a meeting ahead of the conference, where I can hopefully get people, including some police leaders, to agree the principles. So in order to successfully workshop that, the more opinions, thoughts that I can get from people like the activists here in Norway, the easier that job will be. Because to workshop something which is essentially a way of trying to change the ethical approach of an organisation is better developed the more input you have. Because the more input you have, the more legitimacy it has. Because you're talking about ethics, right? And ethics are a mode of behaviour from humans that come from from collective values. So I know it's a lot of words that just to say, please think about this as a future tactic in this struggle.
Yeah, I'm very interested in what comes out of that work, and I'll pick my brain to think about how to contribute. Okay, we have just a few more questions. The next one is about the size of the drug market, and they're wondering, isn't the real problem that we don't have the same amount of money as they do? And I think I have to interpret maybe a little bit here, but if it's as this makes it possible for some to have more than others and use that to corrupt people. So I'm not sure if that's like a socialist statement for people to have like more money in general, or if it is to be interpreted more as just if the apparatus trying to stop the drug cartels, if they just had enough money, then no one could get corrupted. I'm not sure how to. Well, no,
yeah. It's a good point. It's a very good point, because it answers what our opposition sometimes say. Because the truth of the matter is exactly what they've picked up from what was discussed last night, is that organised crime have significantly more resources than policing, significantly more. And the report that's coming out the 30th of October, that by the time people listen to this will be available, the report from Forest the Dust, makes it clear how much more resources organised crime has. More resources organised crime has than policing. Now, our opposition will say that just means we need more investment in policing. We need twice as many cops, twice as much military, much more response, and bigger guns. But it's never going to work, because even by doubling police resources, it'll still be a drop in the ocean. We still will be out-resourced by organised crime, always. It can't be done. and so it's a good point to handle. To point out that they've got more resources, and that is a big problem. But those resources only exist because of prohibition.
Yeah. So do you think, is there any amount of money that we could have in order to stop it? Is there any amount of weapons, or no?
No, there's
it can't be fought like a war.
It can't be fought like a war. The more you fight it like a war, the more the war economy adapts.
It's like what do you call it? Like the Greek mythological beast, like the Hydra?
Yeah, you cut off one head and more heads grow back. So organised crime have allocated a certain amount of resources to their security, their aggression, their paramilitary arms or whatever. If police actually manage to increase their resources to match that, then the other side would just spend more. And like I pointed out, even Mexican organised crime have got more wealth than in terms of GDP than in most West African countries. That enormous wealth can't be matched, even in wealthy economies like Norway, because where are you going to shift the resources from into policing? Are you going to shift it from health? Whereas actually the evidence suggests you reduce your problems with drugs if you invest more in health. We know this, the evidence backs that up. Are you going to move it away from education? We know that education is a good way to prevent people failing in life and becoming more likely to use drugs problematically because of increased chance of trauma. So you're not going to move it from education. What are you going to move it from? Are you going to move it from your climate response? Well, that would definitely seem counterintuitive when you realise prohibition's a contributing factor to the climate crisis. So where are those resources going to come from? Whereas if we moved our resources away from prohibition, if we were able to, because we took legal control of those markets, suddenly all of the resources that we're using to fight prohibition can go into health, into education, and our climate response.
Yeah, it's like going from just expenses to like actual income.
Yeah.
So in the news currently, we're watching the US blow up boats way outside their own territory. And the question is, why do you think Trump is so vocal about this crackdown on drug boats?
Well, mostly it's a political trick. It's to get tough and to make it appear like he's solving the problem, and he's all smoke and mirrors. He's not solving the problem at all. He's just trying to give the impression that he is. But there's an ulterior motive. He's not really attacking cocaine boats. What he's attacking is Venezuela, because all of the boats that he's attacked are Venezuelan boats. Now, Venezuela is one of the states exporting cocaine, but it's a very small player. It's a very small amount. It's a small percentage of the cocaine trade going into the United States from Venezuela. There are boats coming from Colombia or Ecuador, submarines from Brazil, human mules coming from every port. There are, organised crime are spread betters. If you'll send a consignment, you send like 10 different routes. It's not having any impact blowing up boats from Venezuela. It's no impact at all. Just not. If you clamp down on one route of smuggling, then the emphasis, they just shift more of the risk into another form of smuggling, into container boats. He's not blowing up container boats, is he? And more cocaine goes into the United States from containers on big shipping containers than the small boats. The small boats are just the spread betting. They're just spreading the risk between the different routes. So it's having no impact at all on the market. And really, what he wants to do is topple the Venezuelan government. That's what this is about. So he's doing two things. He's attacking Venezuela and trying to provoke a confrontation to topple the Venezuelan government. But at the same time, in front of the American public, he can say that he's getting tough and solving the drug problem.
If I add to this question, why do you think that the organized criminals behind this trafficking are responsible for sending those boats? Why do you think they keep sending boats even though they're literally being like blown up. Why don't they just like they stop the boat operation and they use other ways of getting the drug?
So because the decisions about where the different divisions of deliveries go are made quite early. And sometimes it's because they are passed to middle operators who are then committed to that supply route. And sometimes that decision can't be made so early because those are freelancer operators who've been tasked with doing that, and they've got a big glut of that supply, and that's what they've committed to doing. And they might be so committed to doing that for the next 2 months. So they're just going to stick doing it, and they're just going to keep putting people out because many boats will get through anyway.
Yeah.
You know, even the U.S. Customs U.S. Customs claim to intercept 10% of boats. They don't. There's a lot more boats get through, and you know, boats being blown up are just publicity. So the people sending them out still think it's a reasonable bet, but also they'll be committed by the glut of what they've agreed to deliver.
But it has to be absolutely terrifying for the people like who are going to be sent on those boats to get on them. Like they're being blown up, not even like prison, but blown up.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it'd be terrifying. But they're not going to back out because.
And is that because it's so much money, or also like a violent threat if they don't?
Both.
Yeah.
There's always a stick with a carrot, and a carrot with a stick. Always. That's why we shouldn't. And it sounds like a daft thing to say. We shouldn't stigmatise corruption too much because we don't know as individuals what we would say if we're being threatened with our family being tortured. Oh, as well, you can have $20,000. Or, you know, sometimes there's no choice at all, and we dismiss corruption as a failing of humanity. It's a failing of policy, not a failing of humanity.
Well put. So 2 more questions, and the first one is a person wondering: is there any connection between these drug gangs and the different football firms around the UK? So that's like a UK-specific question. So you please give us some context on this entire scenario. Yeah. Yeah.
So there has historically been some connections between organised football violence, hooligans, and the supply of cocaine and other drugs. There has been, but only really because people who happen to be involved in drugs organised crime at the lower level, not higher cartel level, at a street dealing type of level or regional, dealing, they're also into football and football violence, and so you get that overlap. And you know, and there is a great deal of cocaine consumption nowadays in the football terraces and connected to some of the football, those kind of football supporting gangs. But there's also an overlap between some of the football hooligans, and I mean the people who actually go out looking for the fight. You know, that very British sort of thug. You know, that people know our nation for so well. But there's also links between some of them and security firms. Now, some security firms, and some type of them are also linked to organised crime. You know, some organised crime groups, their front is quite often security, so running doors and nightclubs, those kind of things. It's a very traditional British overlap between organised crime and security firms. It was more so in the 90s and early 2000s than it is now, but there's still an overlap. You know, there's still very infamous gangsters in the UK who own a security firm. And there are overlaps because that sort of development of violence, that sort of intimidation, you know, community machoism, there's all overlaps. So yeah, those things have overlaps within British society. But I would be keen to stress that the increased use of cocaine amongst football supporters on the terraces is not as a result of organised crime influence. It's just because lots of people like cocaine.
Okay, so I think we have the last question, and I think it is a very good question to end with. So this person is asking, what can we, the audience, do to better this problem? And then I guess everyone listening to this podcast or in other ways hearing about this issue.
Well, I mean, not everybody can get involved as much as somebody else. And I'm a full-time activist. I'm quite obsessive, so I can do these things. Other people actually have to work for a living. I understand that. But here in Norway, you've got extraordinary, and I observe this because I speak in lots of different countries, and Norway's a special place because you have a greater percentage of people who have interest in politics, understand politics, have political engagement. You've got direct political events like the one that you so successfully arranged yesterday. And you've got organisations like Safer Drug Policies where people can join and they can have a say and they can be part of the conversation and develop the strategies and the thinking and do the campaigning and the recruiting. You can involve, you've got these mechanisms in Norway that a lot of countries just don't have. And, you even have an element of government support for developing this sort of intellectual development of policy. So it's easier in a way to get involved here. You join Safer Drug Policies. You support what they do, and this is important. And the great thing is that I'm part of the international movement, and the international movement admires this team of activists in Norway. We admire very much what Safer Drug Policies has done, and next year it's going to be the 10-year anniversary.
Yeah,
right?
It is.
So you are greatly admired internationally amongst your peers as an organisation. And so if anyone wants to get involved, that really is, you're in one of the best places in the world to get involved. So that would be my answer. If you want to support and just want to follow what the coalition is doing, you can you can follow me on social media. You can follow Leap. You can follow Clemmy James, Rebecca Lira in Brazil. But you can have access to the knowledge of everything that's going on in the world of drug policy by being part of the team here in Safer Drug Policies.
Well, thank you for the pitch. I really hope more people get involved. It is where a lot of things are not maybe moving in the best direction in the world right now, at least in drug policy, even though it's like a far way ahead to go still in order to get to the policy situations that we want. It is going forward, and we do have the evidence and the human rights, and it is the right side of history to be on, and it feels good to see the movement grow all across the world, really.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so that was the end of this Q&A. Thank you so much for the patience with responding to all these questions so thoroughly. I'm sure that the people asking questions are very happy to have had full responses from you on these questions. And also thank you to everyone who did ask the questions. It really helps us with some of the questions, shed light on different aspects of it, both some of the questions, maybe some things that isn't so, when you're supporting this cause, it's easy to get blindsided maybe a little bit to what would the opposition say, and this highlights some of those things and makes it clear and discussed, and I think that's very important. And thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you again for organising such a superb event.
Thank you.